So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our webinar, The Future of Fish. I am joined by Jim Mellon, the entrepreneur and investor, Lou Cooperhouse, the CEO of Blue Nalu, and Case Lancaster, a marine biologist who consults on marine wildlife and sustainable fisheries and was a board member of the Marine Stewardship Council. Please note this webinar is being recorded and a recording will be distributed following the conclusion of the session. We have published a report on the future of fish, which is available on the Edison website, and listeners will be able to submit questions throughout the webinar via the Q&A tab. Now, turning to the topic today, overfishing and commercial fishing practices are depleting fish populations. Farmed fish has come under scrutiny over the years as intensive production, including greater use of antibiotics, is leading to reduced product quality and raises questions on sustainability. Overfishing poses a threat to global ecosystems with unmeasurable adverse economic and environmental implications. Simultaneously, pollution in oceans, predominantly plastics and heavy metals, is increasingly of concern to consumers and authorities. The future of fish and its sustainability will depend on changing production and consumption habits backed by regulatory moves. Alternatives to natural fish protein, for example, cell-based fish production, are being pursued. So without further ado, let me turn this over to our panelists to introduce themselves. Jim, would you like to start first?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So I am the co-founder of Agronomics, which is a London-listed investment vehicle investing in cellular agriculture and related companies, including actually in Lou Cooperhouse's Blue Nalu company, which we'll be talking about later on. I'm also the author of a book called Moo's Law, All Profits to the Good Food Institute, so please buy it, which is on the subject of this nascent but highly compelling industry, which is going to disrupt agriculture, fishing, and material industries over the next 10 or 20 years and make lots of money, I hope, for investors along the way.
Lou?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Edison Group. Yeah, my name is Lou Cooperhouse, co-founder and CEO of Blue Nalu. We're based in San Diego, California. I have over 35 years experience in the food industry, all in food innovation, technology, commercialization from large corporations, multinationals, but also many startups and also supporting many entrepreneurs along the way. And I'm beyond excited and enthusiastic to lead Blue Nalu, which, as Jim described, I believe will be extraordinarily disruptive to the way we think about seafood in the future and really provide tremendous support for the health and biodiversity of our oceans as well. So many benefits. Look forward to talking to you more about it. Thanks, sir.
And Case.
Hello. Thank you for the invitation. I'm representing Marine Stewardship Council here, but I can also certainly speak about Aquaculture Council. As I was introduced, I've been involved in sustainable fisheries for about 25 years now. And instead of being disruptive, I think that the sustainability is going to be leading the future of fisheries and also aquaculture. I was asked to give in this minute also a brief account of MSC and ASC, Marine Stewardship Council and its sister organization, Aquaculture Stewardship Council, both claim to present a solid basis for sustainable fisheries and aquaculture based on verifiable third-party processes globally. So open to everyone, voluntary to be used. And therefore, it's one of the few credible organizations that present sustainability offers. Nice to be here. Thank you.
So, my first question today is, what do you see as the main issues around commercial fishing and aquaculture, and what is being done to address these? Case, perhaps you can start with this.
Yes, thank you. I think for many fisheries, there is still a growth in overfishing. If you look at the graphs of the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, you see that the proportion of sustainable fisheries is declining over the decades. But there's something else that I would rather like to mention here, because that's a steady change that we can also steadily reverse. But an extra risk is occurring is climate change. And it's already occurring. I'll give an example for both fisheries and aquaculture. Climate change risks lead, for example, to changes in big sea currents. And we're already seeing an example of the consequences of it in the North Atlantic. We are seeing in the last 5 to 10 years or so changes in fish distribution, which means that where people are used to catch their mackerel or herring or other large pelagic species, they move on. And in the North Atlantic, they move to Iceland and Greenland. And now the Icelanders are happy to pick up more of their quota, and therefore there are controversies about quotas. This means that they're generally being overfished. It's a new issue that is of serious concern to what used to be pretty solid industry. On aquaculture, I give a similar example, and one of the biggest risks at the moment will be the availability of feed ingredients. Component of that important component, which they still cannot get rid of, and Lou will probably might be able to add to that subject at some point, is fish feed, fish meal, and fish oil. If you don't feed a salmon with fish oil, it won't taste like salmon. So fish oil is very important. One of the main sources of fish oil is Peru, anchoveta fishery in Peru. 30–40% of the fish oil comes from that area. If we would see a climate change there too, there is a big current occurring there, that's why the anchoveta occurs there, then the availability might disappear and aquaculture may run short of fish meal and fish oil. Now, it's all future, we don't know, it's projected, but these are serious risks for investors. Thank you.
Lou, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
No, I think, Sarah, I think some of the main issues around commercial fishing and aquaculture are really maybe think about differently. I come from the world of the food industry, and supply chain is what we all talk about. We have to deal with the reality that consumers are actually enjoying fish in a great deal. It's actually the per capita consumption is the highest it's ever been. It's expected to grow significantly, particularly in Asia, as GDPs increase and consumption therefore increases as well. So what we're doing is we're just putting more stress on that demand for fish, while in the fundamental question is supply. Can it keep up? Then you also have to address the vulnerability and the variability of that supply chain. Sadly, as we all know from this current pandemic, which God willing will go away soon, but our world is very vulnerable to any number of issues that could result from warming oceans, acidification, algae blooms, tornadoes, monsoons, etc. So just our supply of fish is just very fragile. So that's really part of the rationale for a company like Blue Nalu to really come up with a third supply chain. Wild and farm, now meat, cell cultured, as a more predictable supply chain that's demand driven, not supply restricted. So it really is an opportunity for us to think about seafood in really about feeding the world, and how can we do it, in another way. And that's really kind of the genesis of how this company was born, really thinking differently about a demand-driven, predictable model.
And Jim, how do you view it from an investment point of view?
Well, not so much from an investment point of view, but I'm just going to reinforce what both Kees and Lou said. I was in McDonald's this morning. That's not my regular haunt, but they do have good coffee there. And they also sell something called fillet of fish, as some of you may know. McDonald's, since it introduced fillet of fish, has gone through 6 species of fish until the current one, because they are basically so overfished they don't exist in the oceans anymore, the previous ones, which is an indication of just the systemic strain on fisheries that Keith and Lou were talking about. Keith also talked about antibiotic, well, you did actually, Sarah, antibiotic use in farmed fish. And this is a really important issue because this, combined with the overuse of antibiotics in farmed animals, where 80% of antibiotic use worldwide occurs, causes the potential for another pandemic risk. And this risk would be a bacterial pandemic, not a viral pandemic, such as the one we have at the moment. And if the antibiotics don't work in humans, and it's possible that they might not, anything's possible as we know these days, then the next pandemic, be it bacterial, if it's bacterial, would be a lot worse than the current one. It would be a bit like the Black Death. And fish, the farming of fish, contributes to that possibility. So we've got to do something about that. And then the last point I'm going to make is everyone should watch Seaspiracy. Yes, I know it's a bit over dramatic, but it tells a very interesting tale about the world's fisheries, the mislabeling of fish, the abuse of both fish and the fishermen, and it's worth a look just for the impact. We could only watch half of it. It was so disturbing.
Thank you. And my second question is, what are the investment opportunities in fish, and what do you think investors should be looking for? So, Jim, I think this one is for you.
Yeah, okay. Well, in terms of Keys's area, which is what you might call regular fisheries and aquaculture, there are investment opportunities, obviously, and I'm sure that he knows a lot more about those than I do. And in fact, you can buy Norwegian salmon farms on the Norwegian stock market, which some of which are highly valuable as an example. But what we're looking at is cell aquaculture along the lines of what Lou and Blue Nalu do. Now, Blue Nalu is the biggest of the up-and-coming cell aquaculture upstarts, where fish and crustaceans are grown from cells in laboratory conditions, and hopefully will be on the market in the relatively near future. But the amount of money that's gone into these companies so far is relatively small. In the case of Blue Nalu, I think I'm not talking out of school by saying it's about $85 million so far, and that's by far and away the biggest amount. There's a company in Europe called Blue, with W at the end, which has raised about 7 million euros. There's a company in Hong Kong called Avant Meats, which has raised a small amount of money. And there's a company which is somewhat better capitalized than those two in America called Wild Type, which is producing or trying to produce salmon. That's about, and then there's Shiok Meats in Singapore, which is producing or trying to produce crustaceans in a lab. And that's about the extent of it. Now, bearing in mind that, you know, there are very many companies now engaged in cell agriculture for meat and for dairy and for materials, but not so many in the fish industry. This presents a great opportunity for companies, in my opinion, like Blue Nalu, because the fishing industry is a $200 billion US plus industry, growing at nearly 10% per year, and it is wide open for disruption. Furthermore, the regulatory pathway, as I'm sure Lou will say, is easier for companies engaged in the cell aquaculture industry than it is for the meat cell agriculture companies. And they tend to be further along in terms of their engagement with the FDA and other regulatory authorities. And we could see products from Blue Nalu on the market as soon as next year, and possibly from other companies as well. So it's a wide open opportunity, and as yet it's not, you know, it's not been particularly well capitalized, but I'm sure that that's going to come quite soon. Yeah.
And Lou, actually, as an addition to that, perhaps you can answer sort of both at the same time, is why do you think there's been so much more focus, I guess, in terms of the number of companies, certainly, on cell-based meat rather than cell-based fish?
Yeah, my honest answer, Sarah, is it really is because the technology is better known there. In 2013, the first demonstration of a cell-cultured hamburger product occurred in Europe, actually, by a company that became Mosa Meats. And then obviously Memphis Meats launched a few years later, now called Upside Foods. And frankly, the industry began on the terrestrial animal side because mammalian cell culturing technology was somewhat well known. So you saw a lot of founders that were maybe postdocs or had experience in mammalian cell culturing begin these companies because of knowledge that they knew. When I began BlueNalu, it was really because of where I saw the opportunity, not necessarily where I saw the science. The science, frankly, was unknown. Nobody had really ever propagated any fish cells. Brand new white space. I saw this as an IP opportunity significantly. But I also saw this as very challenging because nobody had ever done this and created what we call stable cell lines from fish species. We've now done that over and over again with a variety of different fish species focused on finfish. And I was excited by seafood versus land animals, frankly, because of what I mentioned earlier, the fact that you have an increasing demand at an increasing price point and a highly variable, vulnerable supply chain that, you talk about sustainability, maybe ships, say 10,000 miles from Southeast Asia to say New York City, experiencing maybe 10, 20, 30% bycatch, maybe 60% yield when it gets to the restaurant, because head, tail, bones, and skin are all thrown in the trash. So our whole concept was, what if we could have arguably 100% yielded fish manufactured, just the fillet, just what people eat, manufactured at a facility, maybe say 100 kilometers away. So it's really a totally vertically integrated, demand-driven model that really eliminates all that supply chain logistics from the equation. So frankly, BlueNalu was really founded based on where the opportunity was the greatest. So I'm very excited by the opportunity in cell culturing, but primarily in seafood because of all the things that I've described. And as Jim mentioned, there's only, roughly half a dozen companies around the world thus far. But if we look at the plant-based category, we're seeing several companies that began with $10 billion valuations when they went public. That's kind of generation one. What we see is cell culturing tech companies are generation two, and really represent the products that are the same product. It's not wild, it's not farmed, it's cell cultured. It is a third form of seafood. It's not a artificial seafood that mimics the same sensory attributes. It is real seafood, and that's really what regulatory authorities have determined, and even groups like the National Fisheries Institute recognize this was originally called in vitro. It's just like it's not a living animal. It's just the fish fillet that we consume, but it really is the same characteristics as conventional products. So we're very motivated. If we're excited by plant-based, people should be really quite motivated by cell culturing because it really needs to come to market. And once it does, I think you'll see considerable investment in this space, particularly as we get regulatory approval and we get first products entering the market, which is, as Jim mentioned, just a couple of years away.
Thank you, Lou. And Case, do you have any observations on this?
Yes, I'd love to. First, let me make a few clarifications. Jim, there was one of the most well-known fisheries scientists made a wonderful comment about Seaspiracy. He said that it contained more lies than an average Donald Trump press conference. That was during the time when Donald Trump was still president, so it was pretty brave of an American scientist to be saying that. But I think the essence, one of the comments I would like to make is stability, what Lou mentioned. I think for any business, stability is important. And for stability, sustainability is a wonderful driver. Because sustainability, to make things sustainable, it will mean that as a consequence, the market would become more stable, the availability would become more stable. I think that's important to keep in mind. Following on what Lou said about a new opportunity for cell culture, I think it would even be the third phase rather than the second phase, Lou, because if you look back in history, you could see first we had fisheries. Aquaculture only started in the late 1950s. And look how it rose. Look how it benefited from the markets, from the demand for seafood products. And so there is still ample of space for further growth, I would think. And let me make a final comment by saying that I believe that yes, so there's an interesting comparison to make. There is a product called surimi. Surimi is very similar. If you go into marketing and demand-driven products, look at what the history you can learn from surimi market, I would say. So for everyone who's interested in investment, that's interesting to know. You're on mute, Sarah.
Sorry about that. Lou, perhaps you can give us your view on this. The sustainability of fishing and aquaculture is coming under increasing scrutiny, and plant-based fish alternatives are not as prevalent and mainstream as meat alternatives. I mean, you've already slightly covered this, but how big do you think the opportunity is for cellular fish? Is it truly the solution to unsustainable practices? Do you see it sort of working alongside the fish industry, or how do you see the industry developing?
I appreciate that question, Sarah. Yeah, as a person who comes from the food industry my whole career, my whole approach at Blue Nalu is to absolutely work in partnership with the food industry. The only way we're going to get our product to market is through partnerships in the supply chain, partnerships in operations, and also in distribution, sales, and marketing. Among our investors is Nutreco, one of the largest suppliers of aquaculture feed on the planet. Rich Products, who makes CPAC and Mori Seafood, United States, and Thai Union, as well as many others in Asia, US, and Europe. So we're really focused on working in partnership with the current supply chain, who all recognize that there's so much volume we can get out of the ocean. And that's only increasing in value over time. So, we're encouraged by the amount of activity coming from strategic partners who really want to work with us, to really, bring products to market, as a new form of seafood that over time, as we're able to have, more infrastructure to provide more volume, it's really the consumers who will decide. We're offering a new product with a new solution. And, there will be wild, there will be farm, there will be cell cultured. And one thing we're really proud of too, Sarah, is we've also been the leaders globally in something that seems trivial, but it's nomenclature, what to call this product. So I literally wrote an article in Medium called "It's Not Wild, It's Not Farm, but what do we call our seafood made from fish cells?" And we actually sponsored peer-reviewed, third-party, independent research published in the journal Food Science, the premier publication in the world in food technology, sponsored by IFT, that really identified, looked at all sorts of names, some of which were a bit challenging. We didn't want it to be called lab grown because it was made in the factory. We didn't want it to be called slaughter free because that's not appropriate. So we really came up with some neutral terms that would be appropriate, and we actually presented them to the FDA. And actually, the consumers decided, and cell cultured seafood was something that was recognized as different than wild and farm. We want consumers to know that this is different, just like they should know if it's wild or farmed as much as they can about conventional seafood. They should know that our product is cell cultured as well. So we've really done, I think, extraordinary job to really work in collaboration with industry, including various trade associations, and even talking with politicians about our business, our products. And in fact, at Blue Nalu, we're not working, for example, on salmon, because that's an American fish that there's an established industry. We're literally working on displacing imports. So bluefin tuna is our first commercial product. And we've also worked on mahi and others as well, which either cannot be farmed or are very difficult to farm raise, or are typically imported to whatever the home nation might be. So, we're really taking a very thoughtful strategy to really working with industry.
And Case, do you have any observations on this and anything to add from your point of view, from a sustainability focus?
Well, thank you, Sarah. Yes, just maybe to reiterate that aquaculture didn't come to replace fisheries, interestingly. So it's just a confirmation of the growing markets. So the global fish capture volume remained constant, more or less, since the early 1990s. And aquaculture just grew since that time incredibly. And I think it's also important for you, for marketing purposes, maybe to keep in mind that there is an increasing interest in the carbon footprint of products. And it so seems that seafood has a relatively low carbon footprint. It certainly depends on how it is produced, with what kind of technique. But I suppose that in your own marketing, Lou, that would become part of your exercise as well. But I think sustainability is here to stay. So I think that needs to be a very strong part of the message that anyone, whatever type of food is produced, would use, including cell culture. You can use it to your advantage, I would say. And final point, I like your idea of being demand driven. I think that's very important, and that would be a pretty big change in in the current seafood world.
And another question, I guess, primarily for you, Case, from a sustainability point of view, but also for Jim and Lou, is what do you think should be the key investor concern when looking at investing in the segment?
To avoid greenwashing. I think that's the most important thing. So when someone relies on a reference point of saying I consider this sustainable, it needs to be credible and verified. And there are lots of things in the world at the moment which are not. There are lots of claims, or rankings rather, as well. And I think that the future will rely on credible third-party, whether they're certification or not, but at least audited mechanisms that are trustworthy and have proven to be trustworthy.
Jim, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I kind of agree with Keith that standards are going to be an increasingly important part of our lives, not just in fishing, but also in other types of foods. And consumers will have an increasing reference to that, including the carbon footprint. And I mean, just off the top of my head, there are many landlocked countries in the world where, on every menu there is fish, and that fish has to travel from somewhere. And it seems to me that there are obvious markets for what Lou and his competitors are going to be producing. Whereas if you are in the Mediterranean, like we are, then there's fish on your doorstep. Or indeed here in the Isle of Man, and Keith and I were talking about the wonderful kippers that come from the Isle of Man, which he and I both like. That seems to me like something that you wouldn't produce in a lab, that you would have delivered on your plate from a local fisherman. So this is not, and I think it's important for all of us to say that this is not about trying to disrupt the entirety of the fishing industry. It's, as Lou said and as Keith said, a third strand of supply to an ever increasing market. It's different to the meat market. In the meat market, I would like to see intensive farming eradicated. In fishing, where there's plenty of good artisanal and sustainable fishing available, it's a very different thing. But the market is extremely big, and if cell-cultured seafood gets 10% of it, it's at least $20 billion a year. So it's a big prize to have. So this is not, we have to eliminate you in order to be successful. This is all about growing together to create sustainable, healthy, properly labeled, low carbon footprint fish for consumers in whatever way it arrives on their plate.
And Lou, perhaps you can address, what do you think is the top consumer misunderstanding in fish, and how can this be addressed?
That's a tough question, Sarah, because the seafood industry is really very challenged with information. We see it all the time in the US. Consumers are just confused about seafood. They don't know what's sustainable, what's better, wild or farm. Does it vary by species? And I think the reality is that the terrestrial animals, beef, pork, chicken, for example, are very well known and understood by consumers. They really have no idea when it comes to seafood. So they're so influenced by their server at a restaurant. Some people are just scared to prepare it at home. They just, it costs a lot and they don't want to take a chance. So I think that, I think it's really speaks to the fact that the seafood industry is, I would just call it, so fragmented worldwide. There are very few major brands we could think about when it comes to seafood. We may think of maybe one category, tuna, or perhaps salmon, maybe in one state, maybe in a can, which is really a lower value state, if you will. But when it comes to prepared, refrigerated, or frozen, or high value products, many of us can think of brands when it comes to poultry or beef or pork. But I think the opportunity here is to create a global brand that is consistent, trusted, and something that Keith mentioned as well is predictable, available year round. That's what cell culturing could do. It could really eliminate that fragmentation, create transparency, and a year-round supply chain that currently does not exist. So that's the excitement for seafood, in a really fragmented $200 billion sector that exists today. So I didn't really answer your question, Sarah, but unfortunately, seafood is just really so there's so many species that people love and enjoy, but they're not available year round, and people quickly forget, and they're heavily influenced by others, what really to select in their diets. But we hope to change that.
Sarah, can I interject here?
Yeah, I was about to say, do you have anything to add?
Yes, please. So, well, just to give an illustration, I believe that the story for marketing is going to be extremely important. Jim described it pretty well. It's going to be, the story needs to be a good story, and it needs to be credible and verified. But the story really matters. And then you can sell anything, I would think. And just to give you an idea, I'm a great Italy lover. And going to Italy, wanting to eat seafood, it's not easy to get local fish, Jim, I'm afraid. It's pretty hard. And so they will sell you salmon. Well, that doesn't come from Italy. And most of it, they will sell you sea bass that is grown in Turkey and Greece. And so the local fish is not on the local market, it's gone elsewhere where there is better appreciation. So building on appreciation, what in the seafood world is called in the jargon choice editing, is going to be very important, and I think doable. It's marketable, but the story needs to be good, like Jim just explained.
Great. Well, thank you very much for all your comments. I mean, I guess I'm going to try to briefly summarize, but I guess from what we've learned today is in terms of changes in fish distribution have caused controversies with quotas. Aquaculture presents its own issues with the availability and the supply of fish feed if we look into the future. And we've got the question of consumption growing and how can the supply chain keep up? And this is what Blue Nalu is trying to address with sort of having a demand-driven business, with cell agriculture being an exciting new area. We have many companies involved, but not specifically in fish. Most of the companies are involved in meat or in sort of other spaces. And we've heard Blue Nalu believes in working in partnership with the food industry, and that there's an increasing interest in the carbon footprint. Therefore, this is one of the things that will play into positively for cellular foods, given that sustainability, as Kay said, is here to stay. And there will have to be increasing and improving standards on sustainability certifications, etc. I think it's time now to open up to Q&A, and we have got quite a lot of questions. Firstly, in terms of some of the questions are saying, I think it's specifically for Lou, how does the taste and the texture of cell-cultured fish actually compare to sort of standard fish?
Appreciate the question. Yeah, we founded the company based on being culinary centric. So we know that despite all the, I think he's mentioned how, and Jim as well, how important it is to communicate what we're doing in all cases. But at the end of the day, people might purchase things the first time based on, that presentation, but it's really the second purchase happens based on taste. So the product needs to deliver and really give you everything that you love about seafood or whatever else you're purchasing. So yeah, culinary is core to us. We've already done proof of concepts with several species, among them yellowtail amberjack and mahi-mahi. And our goal was the same thing. Does the product perform the same, not just taste, but how do you prepare fish? Perhaps 3 ways. You might cook it. What does that mean? You grill it, you saute it, you pan fry it, you deep fry it, you microwave it, you steam it, what have you, or you prepare it in an acidified marinade. What do I mean by that? You're making poke, kimchi, ceviche, or you prepare it raw. So we actually were able to demonstrate that our product has the same characteristics. It browns the same, cooks the same, it is the same, and nutritionally it's the same as conventional seafood. So that's at proof of concept stage. Now what we're at is actually doing that in increasingly larger scales of commercialization. One of our strategic partners is Griffith Foods, a US-based company who really has expertise in sensory and culinary science. And really, we've been working with them to benchmark our product versus conventional seafood. Our goal, nobody could tell the difference. We can literally, ideally, take we saw about how fragmented this industry and how variable the supply chain is. But we can actually identify what is the best tasting, best quality, say, bluefin tuna. And our goal is to actually have the same characteristics as that, but there is such huge variability, whether it's Atlantic or Pacific, it's raised in a farming or ranching operation, or it's wild. But that's something we can do, and we're definitely driven to that culinary excellence.
And actually, as an add-on to that, somebody's asking how the nutritional content of cell-grown fish compares to fresh fish.
It's the same. So it needs to be the same, frankly. Unlike the plant-based industry, which is working on burgers, and it obviously goes back to the milk days of plant-based milks, consumers were confused that it may be called almond milk or soy milk, but it did not have the same nutritional characteristics, maybe did not have calcium or other things that were expected. So in our case, and the FDA wants us to demonstrate that our product has the same nutritional characteristics as conventional fish, and we are able to accomplish that down to the amino acid level. So yes, same thing in all ways.
Thank you. And another question is, as we're talking about sustainability of fisheries, what are the sustainability concerns for cell-cultured seafood? Perhaps, Case, you can start on this.
Well, I think the most important component would be carbon footprint, or so ecological footprint in general. Starting with carbon, one would say it's locally grown. Look where the ingredients come from. What is the input? What's the output? If you can make an equation there, you can give an answer to any question on that point. And therefore, as Lou mentioned, if it's locally grown, you want to make sure that it's locally supplied as well, so that your markets will not be in the other side of the world. That already reduces your footprint enormously. Otherwise, I would think it's comparatively small compared to both fisheries and agriculture. What would be your view, Lou?
Agree, Kees. I mean, I think like with whenever you're trying to do any kind of comparative information on sustainability, carbon footprint, you need to look at the control and the test. So the control is conventional seafood, but the control is very, the range is extraordinary. So, mahi, for example, one thing we looked at, comes from Peru, Ecuador, Taiwan to America. So you almost need to look at the sustainability metrics by the nation. Talk about a data nightmare. During what time of the year, what are the percent imports coming from what location, under what conditions, and then comparing that to your new basis. So in our industry, we're a weird analogy, but we're a little bit like the beverage industry and Coke, Pepsi, if you will. We're using water and energy, but we're producing products locally. So it's a bit like vertical farming in a way too. So it's a vertically integrated seafood operation that's displacing all that imports, all those foam coolers, dry ice, shipping, fuel, high cost of labor. But it is an extraordinary effort to really do a sustainability metrics. We look forward to that. And anybody listening today who would like to work with us on this is quite a challenging thing to manage with data. But we've been talking about this from the birth of the company, and it is challenging to really figure this out. In the meantime, we're still trying to really do an analysis of what large scale production looks like, so we could add that as our new basis.
And actually, on the back of that, there is another question on how much fish, sort of in kilos, what actual volume per year can Blue Nalu realistically deliver? I guess that is very dependent on the time frame, but I'll leave that open to you to answer, Lou.
I think one is one question is where will the demand for this be? As Jim mentioned, if we get 10% of the marketplace is $20 billion. The A.T. Kearney consulting company suggested or projected that cell cultured meat products could represent 35% global market share by 2040. Well, that's all based on how many factories can we build, how quickly, under what regulatory climate could occur. So there's no shortage of challenges in getting this accomplished. So we don't know how many pounds or kilos we could produce per factory per year. But at the end of the day, it'll be about an awful lot of capital expenditures going into the space to build lots of factories. Today's model looks at really expensive equipment called bioreactors to produce this product. But nobody has ever done this at large scale. So this is truly core to Blue Nalu, is what does large scale production look like? We're currently doing a techno-economic analysis to really think that through. This is the third time we're doing this. But we're core to our whole system is really identifying how quickly can we get to large scale production and also demonstrate profitability, right from the get-go. So therefore, these will be very financeable factories because the EBITDA should be pretty strong right from the beginning. So that'll present a really great opportunity to grow us hopefully very quickly.
And Lou, important for your business, I suppose, would be also components like building a circular economy. So you try to make sure that as you can have your circuit as close as possible, using your wastewater, make sure your effluents are extremely limited, etc. That's the big tech at the moment, and that's happening. So you will have to float on that stream.
Exactly right, Kees. Yeah, we're looking at different kind of co-location opportunities that could create that circular economy model as we think about large scale production, and that's a really important point.
And I'd just like to add, Sarah, on margins, the cell aquaculture business at scale, if Lou and his cohorts can get to scale, and I think they can, it's been demonstrated in some models in meat so far, for instance, and in leather, that the margin potential is very high. I mean, we're all familiar with Tokyo Fish Market and slabs of tuna going for millions of dollars. The opportunity to produce that tuna, which is identical to the best in species at a much lower price in an industrial setting is absolutely there, creating a price umbrella. And the last thing I'll say is I do think that conventional food producers, I'm not talking about wild fishing, but possibly fish farms, will be subject to carbon taxes over the next few years. This is the way of the world, and there's no escaping it, that polluting industries, including the dairy industry, the beef industry, the chicken industry, and possibly fish farms, will be subject to carbon taxes. Now, what's the implication of that? Well, it means that there'll be some recipient of carbon credits, and it could be that companies like Blue Nalu and competitors will receive carbon credits, and that's something I'm very anxious to talk to Lou about and other companies in our portfolio. But it also gives them a price umbrella in the early stages of their rollout, that their competitors who are highly emitting will be subject to higher prices, and giving Lou and other companies the opportunity of building scale more rapidly. The key components going into the production of any proteins, including fish, are coming down rapidly, and hence the name of my book, Moore's Law, because it's rather like Moore's Law. You're seeing as scale up occurs, prices come down, volume goes up. And the key components, bioreactors, growth factors, nutrients, or otherwise known as media, the prices are coming down dramatically just at the time when Lou is about to scale up into industrial production.
Great, thank you. And more questions in terms of the cellular fish are if it can sit alongside, in your view, plant-based fish, and if it will eventually sort of elbow out plant-based fish.
Yeah, I think one thing I want to mention that Keys mentioned was surimi. So there obviously is a market for surimi, particularly in products like prepared salads and soups and other categories. I think one way to think about the seafood industry is as a customer does. Is it an entree, an appetizer, soup, salad? How is a product being served? So when we founded Blue Nalu, my whole focus was on center of the plate, high value, the fillet, whole muscle product form, if you will, the sashimi grade bluefin tuna, saku block of toro. So it's really, going for the goalposts, as we would say, the high-end products that plant-based can't do. So, there's some things surimi could do, some things plant-based could do. I think a plant-based, as it has shown thus far, similar to some of the cell culturing companies, is in what I call the ground-informed category. Jim mentioned, having or familiar with McDonald's filet of fish. That's a ground-informed. That's a product that is used in a lower value product application, not typically found in a center of the plate entree or an appetizer that you might enjoy in a different occasion. So people consume different things at different times. So I think what's really important, plant-based will be very successful in certain categories like ground-informed products. And there are companies that have launched there, and some companies doing canned tuna. That's not tuna, but it is a plant-based equivalent. But you won't, to me, there's no reason for cell culturing to go that way when we could really demonstrate, the same as characteristics as whole muscle value-added forms. So answer your question, it's not like anybody's edging out anybody. It's really, everybody needs to find and pick their place on the menu. And that's what we did from day one of Blue Nalu. And I think that's what we're seeing the plant-based movement too. Surimi has a place, conventional fish will have a place, but so I think it's really all about giving consumers lots of choices for different menu applications.
And Lou, again, what are the key limits to the scalability of your product in terms of processing and inputs? And also, again, in the same vein, does the production of cell-based fish have high consumption footprint? And, does it generate much waste? How energy intensive is it?
It's a lot of questions there. So yeah, the challenges are frankly quite extraordinary. Nobody had ever propagated fish cells before. Nobody had ever thought about how to build a factory before. No government anywhere in the world had ever approved this product for sale to the public. No consumers ever had it before. These are all challenges. How do you communicate this product? What do you call this product? We're tackling these one at a time. But at the end of the day, it's all about how do you achieve scale production and high amount of capacity with limited CapEx. So this is a factory. Ultimately, it looks a bit like a microbrewery. Picture that level of automation, that level of stainless steel, pumping out large volumes of products. But the question is, how do we get there? And that will take a few more years still. But we're quite excited by that. The regulatory issue will clear itself up over the next couple of years. We're seeing Singapore has already approved this product, as many of the listeners may know. The United States has been very actively involved with discussions. The EU also has a regulatory infrastructure in place. We're seeing various nations in Asia also exploring this quite deeply. And we're involved in these conversations, so we know about them firsthand. So we're seeing the world really on the regulatory side. Over the next couple of years, you will see many companies approving these products for sale. Then it's really a question about getting companies like BlueNalu, really demonstrating that scale production, and really what kind of CapEx will be required. So that's the holy grail here, and we're just within 5 years of, my opinion, the first large-scale factory breaking ground somewhere in the world, hopefully various places.
Okay, thanks. And again, there's another one for you, Lou, sorry. But can you talk about how you decide which geographic markets and specific fish or seafood you initially target, given the scale of your opportunity? And also, I think if you can just reiterate the fact that bluefin tuna is one product that you mentioned, but there have been some questions just in terms of, is that the only product that you're doing? And just to clarify that it isn't.
No, actually, I'm a big fan of the decision-making matrix. How do you make a decision? So actually, I applied that whole logic to species selection. So again, on the founding of the company, we put together a matrix. How do you decide what fish to choose, given how fragmented and how many species people enjoy? And we put together a matrix and weighted various attributes. Those attributes included products that are imported, difficult to farm raise, where frankly, the political issue could be addressed, and also where we could create jobs and build factories and not be disruptive to commerce, if you will. But we also looked at high mercury contents, like bluefin tuna represents, and also high value. So a number of attributes were considered, and through that exercise, we actually wanted to be a supply chain solution, not a single species focused company. And we focus on the broad category of finfish. We've actually created stable cell lines from 8 different saltwater, freshwater finfish species thus far. But of those, bluefin tuna clearly by far was the #1 selection in our species selection matrix for all those attributes I mentioned and more. And frankly, we wanted to have a product that had global interest. Asia is a big area of our focus. The per capita consumption of seafood is somewhere about between 3 to 5 times what we're seeing in America and in Europe. And it's expected and projected to grow significantly. So we're very hyper-focused on the opportunity in Asia. 80% of global catch today, I believe, goes to Japan. Keys would know better than me, but that's what the data shows. So we can literally democratize bluefin tuna, make this accessible with a variety of benefits, but also no longer make this supply restricted, but demand driven, and over time democratized and accessible to others, ideally at price parity or better as we drive our costs down over time.
And still, I would like to reiterate, Lou, marketing will be very important. I'll give you the example of Norwegian salmon in Japan. In the 1980s, there was no Norwegian salmon in Japan. So they started in 1986, and there was no, they wanted a market of raw salmon. So you couldn't get any sushi of salmon in Japan at those days. And Pacific salmon doesn't do it really well. So they decided to push it, and it took them 10 years or so. Well, look at it now. And you can't get a sushi without salmon. And so your marketing story will be, from day one, important. Any market is susceptible to a good marketing strategy.
Agree.
And another question, actually, in terms of what Lou, you've just said, with Singapore having approved cell-based product commercialization, why haven't we yet seen a Blue Nalu product there? And can you also comment on, you talked about price parity. Can you talk about when you see that happening in the market?
Yeah, we're certainly interested in Singapore and various markets in Asia. Every company, one of the questions you asked earlier is, investable companies need to focus. So we're focusing on a singular market right now, the United States with bluefin tuna. But yes, we're hyper focused, as I mentioned, on Asia. We are in discussions with numerous nations in Asia on the regulatory requirements for our product, and we are certainly talking with Singapore among them. So we're really focused on really building up our infrastructure in the United States first. That's where our team is, and that's where we're putting our efforts right now. And your other question was about how soon we see price parity. I think this industry, for those who are a little familiar with it, and Jim's book Moore's Law describes it, is a historically a pharma grade business model for mammalian cell culturing. We are, for the first time, utilizing a pharma grade, business model to create food. I come from the food industry where you measure volume in, how many hundreds of units can you make per minute. The farm industry, talks about, grams of product maybe in an hour. So that whole business model of high margins, of pharma grade raw materials is migrating to food grade raw materials. So the answer to your question, it's all about, like many industries, economies of scale. So we need to get some factories built, and we have already seen our own costs drop down dramatically, and we're still buying at the gram quantities for some of these expensive raw materials. 95% cost reduction we've seen over the past year in our media costs. So that's without even attributing some of the economies of scale that we will see when we start building factories in the future. So yeah, that's why we think price parity is very attainable, particularly in the case of seafood. As prices continue to escalate, our costs will continue to decrease.
And actually, just a sort of a quick one in terms of, are there any fish species that are easier to grow, sort of in terms of cell culturing than others?
We've been able to. So far, the answer is it's a weird statement, but right now we're seeing such huge difference between on the conventional world there's bluefin tuna, Toro product, and then there's pollock. Hugely different prices. In our world, our costs are relatively the same. So and we have been able to achieve thus far any finfish we've worked on without any problem. So we can grow the cells, but now we're actually developing processes to grow them at large scale volumes. We don't see any difference between finfish. We haven't yet tackled crustaceans in any major way, but crustaceans and mollusks are certainly possibilities for us to think about in the future. Lobster, crab, scallops, things like that, makes sense from a consumer point of view and things that we feel are achievable. But
and
right
high
now,
value.
And high value, exactly, and meet our species selection model quite nicely. But right now we're focusing on bluefin tuna and all hands on deck on getting that to the market.
Great. And there's a question for Jim in terms of how does agronomics see the sort of fish cultured space, and are you looking to invest further into it at present?
The answer is yes. We own about 6% of Blue Nalu. I think I'm right, Lou, and extremely solid supporters of Blue Nalu. We also have some shares in Shiok Meats, and we've been looking at Avant Meats based out of Hong Kong. And obviously we'll look at any other companies that come to our attention. But let's bear in mind, the seafood market is $200 billion. It's extremely exciting. There are some good companies and led by Blue Nalu in that industry, but the meat market is $1.4 trillion. It's 7 times the size. So it's a bigger prize from an economic point of view. the picks and shovel market, which is the making of the bioreactors, the media, and the growth factors that Lou has to buy to produce at scale, is another area of interest to us. And of course, materials like leather, collagen, and then of course the dairy market, which is about a $750 billion market around the world, is also ripe for disruption, and it's happening actually right now. So there are plenty of markets out there. Seafood is one of the prime ones, but it's not the only one. So Agronomics will have, I would think, 10% of its portfolio in the seafood area going forward.
Great. Well, I'm mindful of time. It is now 5 o'clock. So thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining me today. And thank you for answering all the questions that have come in from the listeners. As a reminder, again, this webinar has been recorded, and the recording will be distributed at the end of the session. Thank you very much.